My background's actually architecture, not archaeology. I've always been interested in archaeology, and in fact, when I first turned up to start my architecture course, I couldn't work out why there were so many construction subjects and nothing to do with kind of history and ancient stuff. And I realised that I actually enrolled in the wrong subject. Which says a lot for me at the time. But I've always been interested, but somehow came back to it very late. And through a series of studios I ran in Athens, starting in the 1990s, taking architecture students over there and doing design projects and taking them around the historical sites. And whilst we were there in Athens, we met up with two archaeologists, one Eric Iverson, who's, I found out later, is one of the main people working on the Anatolian city of Amorium, and the other one was Kenneth Sheedy, who was at that time the director of the Australian Archaeological Institute in Athens. And through them I actually got a taste for Byzantine architecture, something which I knew nothing about, really. So what I'm showing, that introductory image, I'll get back to later on. It's part of my, I guess, attempted reconstruction of what I consider to be one of the great works of architecture in history, which unfortunately, because it's not a church, isn't there anymore. It turned into a quarry. So that's what you can see today. Basically footings of buildings that used to exist. And in fact, most of it used to exist until about 1600, when the Sultan Ahmed I decided he was going to build a great mosque, what's now known as the Blue Mosque, next to Hagia Sophia, the great Byzantine church, which had survived right through from its 6th century version through till the 17th century. So in a sense, Sultan Ahmed was proving that he could do as well as Justinian. Okay, the topic of the Great Palace, which is the subject really of my dissertation, has been around since the 17th century, scholars reading Byzantine manuscripts and trying to reconstruct what has disappeared from those words. And it had a flurry of architectural interest in the early 20th century, when European archaeologists could have access to the sites. By the Second World War, this simply became impossible. And then very recently there's been another excavation, this time by Turkish archaeologists, but also a number of scholars, Jonathan Bardil, Ken Dark, Michael Featherston, in his work with the University of Paris, Maria Carrile, and a whole bunch of German scholars, which necessitated me to translate from the German, which was very difficult. Bauer, Lüchterhand, Klein, Schreiner and Berger. And significantly for me, Anne Moffat from the ANU and Maxime Tal have published the first English translation of a 10th century manuscript known as the Book of Ceremonies. And the University of Paris is well on the way to completing a completely annotated French version. So, in a way, it was, in terms of timing, it was almost perfect for me. I don't have a background in languages. Most of the texts, well, apart from the ancient texts, obviously you need to study for decades to be competent to read them. And then most of the modern publications are not in English. With the virtue of Google Translation, suddenly all that stuff becomes accessible. So there's one thing that's been missing from all the scholarship, and that's an architectural perspective. Really because, well, the architecture apart from Hagia Sophia isn't there anymore. There are just traces. Now, I'll try to explain how I've gone about trying to reconstruct the palace. The Great Palace, to Megas Palation, as it is called in Byzantine texts, to distinguish it presumably from the various other palaces in the city, was arguably one of the most architecturally influential building complexes in history. If you think of the Lateran Palace and the Vatican palaces in Rome, and all the European palaces that derive from the example of Charlemagne's capital at Aachen, all indirectly owe their genealogy to this one complex. And I'd also argue that it was one of the main intermediaries between the West and the East, the Mediterranean world, Northern Europe, and the empires of Persia, and later the Umayyad and Abbasid Caliphates. So what you see there on the left, the Lateran Palace in the early 9th century, and the remains of Charlemagne's palace at Aachen. The difficulty for scholars is that the site of the Great Palace is at the heart of a city that's been continuously and intensively occupied throughout its long history. Its structures have long since been spoliated for building materials. Literally, as I said, it's been used as a quarry, and the fine bits of architectural ornament, like the columns, of course, were highly valued and reused. More recently, the remains have been quietly erased to make way for tourist hotels. Finally, above its core, as I said, was built between, I think it's 1609 and 1616, the Sultan Ahmed or Blue Mosque, itself of world heritage and great religious significance, so it's not going anywhere. Look inside the Blue Mosque, however, and you'll be looking in part at the marbles taken from the great ruins that preceded it on this site. So the columns in the forecourt of Sultan Ahmed Mosque are all Roman. And they probably come from the Sphendon, which is the curved end of the Hippodrome. The columns were certainly standing in the 17th century. And on the inside of the mosque, again, you find Roman columns. So the logic is they came from as short a distance as possible, probably on the site. So there are several different strands of investigation in my research. First, the evidence supplied by Byzantine texts, in particular the 10th century Book of Ceremonies. It was written by or for the Emperor Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitus, great title, means born in the porphyry room. Himself a sort of antiquarian who compiled old sources stretching back to the time of Justinian and later into this record, as well as restoring ancient structures within the palace. So one of the buildings he restored may well have been constructed by Constantine I in the 4th century. And there you find in the 10th century the building being restored and used for ceremonies. The Book of Ceremonies instructs us on what the palace was for. Firstly, the maintenance of Roman tradition, the housing of holy relics, the carrying out of ceremonies, both religious and pagan in origin, significantly the reception of guests, both Byzantine nobles and foreign emissaries, crucially the emissaries of the Persian Empire. And increasingly, it was used for the administration of the Byzantine Empire. There are several other texts that directly describe the Great Palace, notably the account of the emissary from the Holy Roman Empire, the Saxon Emperor Otto, Liutprand, the Bishop of Cremona, who's written a great account. The second major strand is archaeological evidence, primarily the campaigns of the German Archaeological Institute, or DAI, prior to World War I. The authors of the report were Theodor Wiegand, the former DAI director in Istanbul, and Ernest Mambury, a resident of Istanbul, who produced the drawings like this one. Aside from the surviving book copies, almost all the archives of the DAI campaign have been lost, including all the drawings, through war damage. So basically the surviving books are the sole record. The second major contribution was made in two campaigns by the University of St Andrews in 1935 to 38 under David Baxter and Gerard Brett, and between 1952 and 54 under David Talbot Rice. There's also a current but stalled excavation of the grounds of the former Sultan Ahmet prison, now the luxury 5-star Four Seasons Hotel, east of Hagia Sophia by the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. Significantly, this excavation has located the remains of the great bronze gate that formed the entrance to the palace, the Halke. Now, I said it's a stalled excavation. That's because Erdogan wants to build some kind of tourist resort and theme park on top of the excavations, and the archaeologists are using Turkish law, whilst there is still some left, to prevent him. So no funding. The archaeology often really only offers us fragmentary traces of what must have been a vast and labyrinthine complex. Here is part of my work in progress on the so-called Trepan House, or staircase hall, drawn by Mambury before and after World War I. It connected the palace to the Nea Ecclesia, or new church, of Emperor Basil I, the Macedonian. Behind it, which I'll show you if I can get this thing to work, yes, along here, is a vast vaulted passage. So there's the staircase hall, or house, then this vaulted passage, then behind it another vaulted passage, which is much older. This is probably 6th century, this is 9th century or thereabouts, and it keeps on being added to. So Basil builds the staircase to connect across, probably at this level, to his church, and then at a later stage there's a bridge. So if you can imagine a building complex that started in the 4th century and is still being added onto in the 13th century. It's like Gormenghast, if anyone's read that novel. The overall palace area was almost 900 metres in the north-south direction by 300 metres in the east-west section, or roughly 27 hectares, and existed on a number of levels. So the structure you see here, you can just make it out here. There's the original ground level, and there's the projected upper story. Is about 26 metres high. And this was a minor part of the palace. It was a utilitarian part of the palace. I'm not sure if you can see this, but this is work in progress where we've begun to model up what we know about the palace and then to interpolate what we think is probable and implied by the remaining structures, rather than using or practicing the usual Hollywood visualizations, which create a wonderful realistic image, but where nothing is certain or verifiable. These basement structures that you see here occupy an entire block of Sultan Ahmet district. In the middle, which is here, we've pieced together what appears to be a great hall, 13 by 17 metres and 8 metres high, which has not been recorded to date. And it's entirely implied by Mambury's drawings. He himself didn't understand what he was drawing. We intend to complete the modelling for the entire palace, funds permitting. One problem we've discovered is that none of the existing drawings completely accord with each other, so everything needs to be adjusted to an accurate digital map. The second problem is that despite calls before the Second World War for an archaeological park to preserve the ruins, most of the remains have subsequently been destroyed, or even worse, crudely reconstructed by Turkish architects for tourist reasons, thus destroying their archaeological value. So in a sense, the digital model we will construct will become the most accurate site for future research. The most spectacular archaeological discoveries so far, the remains that you can see as a tourist visiting Istanbul, have been the mosaic peristyle and apse hall excavated by the St Andrews University team, belonging to what was possibly a complex for the reception of circus factions that later became part of a residential quarter of the complex in the 9th century. Now, the interesting thing about this is that most of this complex, which consisted of a peristyle court and an apse hall and a number of other buildings, was probably constructed at the end of the 6th century and the beginning of the 7th century. It's thus the latest example of the Roman courtyard house or atrium-based house known to exist in the world. The third strand of evidence is the study of analogous structures, structures which can form comparanda, such as imperial Roman precedents, and in particular the great complex of the Flavian Palace on the Palatine Hill in Rome and Hadrian's Villa in Tivoli. Now, so much of the Palatine exists that the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin has been able to pretty well completely reconstruct it. So here you find a really fantastic digital model where they really have evidence for what they've constructed for the last stage, built by Maxentius shortly before Constantine killed him. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Well, he's constructed on the roof of the Palatine Palace an ornamental pool or basin which can reflect the city of Rome viewed through these colonnades. So the whole of the Palatine was really a kind of like a pleasure palace for holding receptions, according to the most recent scholarship. There's also the connection you can make to late antique palaces of the Tetrarchs period. So this is the end of the 3rd century, the early stages of the 4th century. And here the most significant examples are the retirement palace of Diocletian at Split in Yugoslavia, what used to be Yugoslavia, that of Galerius at Gamzigrad, what's now Serbia, and the latter emperor's palace at Thessalonica. Other complexes you can compare to the Great Palace, so the huge early 4th century palatial villa at Piazza Armerina in Sicily, which I'm sure some of you have visited, and the equally vast complex you see here, probably a governor's palace in Cercadilla or Cordoba in Spain, and finally the Palace of Maxentius on the Via Appia outside Rome. And all of these palaces share certain elements, like, for example, the great apsidal reception hall, this semicircular forecourt or hemicycle, and what are known as triconches, dining halls. Another example is the Caesarean Palace in Rome, parts of which are datable to the earliest period of the Great Palace. And in fact, the Caesarean Palace was owned by the mother of Constantine I, Helena. It was almost certainly, well, this pavilion within it, the erroneously known as the Temple of Minerva Medica, it's the building you see as you come into Rome Station, was almost certainly a pleasure pavilion. And to these examples, I would add the Villa dei Quintili, or the Villa of the Quintilii family, on the Via Appia outside Rome, which has revealed a similar semicircular complex. You can just see it here. It's only just been excavated recently. Similar to the examples found in Constantinople, dating to the 5th century. Significantly, this was an imperial estate from quite an early period, and a lot of the construction happened during the period of the Emperor Hadrian, including this circular reception hall, the hemicycle, and the octagonal hall here. So the fact that it's associated with Hadrian, you know, the great emperor, means that perhaps it became a model for, if you like, aristocratic or later emperors' palaces. And in fact, there are records of a rotunda and hemicycle used in the Great Palace as late as the 9th century AD. And here you see, if I turn the slide, a photograph of the recently excavated circular triclinium with underfloor heating and a hemicycle on the other side. And finally, there are the analogous examples of early Byzantine palaces. So, for example, in Athens, you find the 5th century Palace of the Giants, as it's known, within the Agora site, which also has a semicircular forecourt, but also the palaces of Rhegion, Eliausa, Sebaste, both in southwest Turkey. In Istanbul, northwest of the square of At Maidan, in front of Hagia Sophia, is the supposed palace of Antiochus, a government official. This vast palace dates to the 5th century and again possesses a rotunda and hemicycle, the same typology as the period of Hadrian. A similar structure to this was found a little further to the north in present-day Gulhana Park. And you find the same form in the rotunda and hemicyclical forecourt beneath the Middle Byzantine church of the Myraleon in Istanbul. From these sources, a picture emerges of not so much a building or complex of buildings, but rather a city in miniature. Sorry, this last example is Eleusa Sebaste in Turkey. There's no blueprint for the form of the Great Palace, but certain elements in common, such as enormous scale, elaborate spatial sequences, what we today call a kind of Baroque sense of space. Equally elaborate building forms, such as multi-apsidal structures and elevated walkways, by means of which the dominus or prince could avoid crossing paths with his inferiors. Very important. And in fact, in this late Roman period, the halls become more and more elaborate in their form. And they, in fact, bear little relation to the far simpler classical villas to be seen at, for example, Pompeii, which raises the issue of their derivation. Where do they come from? What's their purpose? Baldini Lippolis, an Italian scholar, has associated this increasing elaboration with the consolidation of administrative power in the aristocratic estates that accompanied a decline in civic institutions. And this might be part of the answer. For example, the governor's palaces become the administrative centres. But I'd also suggest that another stimulus was the increased cultural exchange between East and West. And, of course, similar vast reception halls featuring, for example, circular spaces were built by the Sasanian great kings. In this discussion, I'll suggest the topographical layout of the early Great Palace as it existed by the reign of the Emperor Heraclius, who, of course, is known to history as having rebuffed the invasion of the Persians by launching a counterattack into their heartland, and unfortunately in the process weakening both empires and leading to the Arab conquests. This early stage of the palace consisted of a building known as the Trickling, or the Golden Dining Room, to the south, the Daphne Palace at the centre, the Caria Gate and Hippodrome to the west, and the Guards' Quarters, Chalky Gate and Magnaura to the north. So I'll just run through that. So here's the Trickling, here's the Daphne Palace, the Baths, the Halke Gate, and the Magnaura, which is probably a corruption of Great Hall. So I'll talk in a little while about the plan. But just to give you a bit of the geography, there's the Basilica Cistern, which you can still see, the St Mary of the Copper Workers, Hagia Sophia, a great hospital, Hagia Irini, and further to the north, around about here, the Forum of Leo, which was the last Roman forum built in the, I think, 5th century. The available evidence indicates a pronounced connection between the architectural typologies and motifs of the Great Palace up to at least the end of the 7th century and late antique architecture. So Rome didn't cease when it declined in the West. We often say that, yes, Byzantium is the continuation of Rome, but in fact Roman architecture as we know it didn't stop. It kept getting built within the walls of Constantinople. And secondly, we can observe a marked resemblance between descriptions of the Great Palace and the motifs and layouts of the later palaces of the Lateran and Carolingian palaces. In particular, it's an extraordinary thing, the emphasis in these late, or let's say early medieval palaces upon ridiculously elongated passages. So, for example, in the Lateran, the poor popes had to sort of trudge up and down this enormous long passage. Serving what purpose? Good question. I mean, there's a church, there's this meeting hall, probably used for dining, and another tri-conch hall over here, and some residential living quarters here, and various other buildings coming off. It appears that the actual procession was ritual in its nature. That aspects, well, Luchterhahn would argue that aspects that that actually originated within the Great Palace, the use of the procession through the palace, were taken up by these emulators and built into their palaces. This highly ritualised, elaborate ceremonial suggests the development, in a sense, away from the palaces of the classical period and into another form. And it's proposed, therefore, that the Great Palace complex serves as a link between late antique architecture and that of the Middle Ages. So I'm really suggesting that this site was a crucial fulcrum in the development of European culture. For the early Byzantine emperors, to remember the Roman past was equally to assert their legitimacy in the present. Such a recourse to the authority of the past was to remain a characteristic of imperial symbolism as late as Constantine VII in the 10th century, as evidenced by his foreword in the Book of Ceremonies. And I find this passage really evocative. Many things indeed are likely to disappear with the length of time from when they were made and then used. Numbered among these is also this great and precious thing, which is the exposition and codification of imperial ceremonial. Because it was neglected and, so to speak, died, one really saw the empire without ornament and beauty. So the reenactment of this ceremonial within the palace and within the great streets of Constantinople was an act of reconnecting with the Roman past, reasserting the connection with the Roman past. It's clear from this passage that ancient ceremonial formed part of the ornament and beauty that increased imperial majesty. The great buildings of the palace and their decorations also served this function, I'd argue, of increasing imperial prestige and also the prestige of the empire in the eyes of both citizens and foreigners. Regardless of how much the visitors and perhaps also the participants would understand of the rituals, the spatial performance was clear enough, enhancing and distantiating the figure of the emperor. Bauer argues that the palace was presented to visiting embassies as a veritable paradise on earth. The sensations engendered both by the ornamented building interiors and by the performance of space through aestheticised ritual within these halls was literally overwhelming, through the elevation of the status of the emperor and the diminution of the status of the visitor. And there are Byzantine descriptions of, kind of long-haired barbarian ambassadors being led into these halls and sort of falling prostrate at the majesty that they see. Within the great palace of the Byzantine emperors, it could be argued that the Roman past was remembered, not only through the historical writing of palace scholars, but also through the perpetuation or continuation of late antique imperial ceremonial and late antique architecture until the Middle Byzantine period, at least. But it was a reconstructed past in which Constantine I, its founding emperor, was recast unambiguously as a Christian monarch and also a saint. Other spatial performances, such as the games in the Hippodrome, the ceremonies of the guilds, the Gothic dances, thought by Bolognese to have originated in the 4th century, the Lupercalia and the Adventus, which are all Roman ceremonies, continued late antique traditions while existing within a transformed social context in which the imperial court contested with the patriarchal hierarchy the right to spiritual authority. Through palace ceremonial, both the palace itself and the city were presented as possessing God-given legitimacy. The early great palace of the Byzantine emperors was, in many ways, the product of an attempt to construct an ideal city, associated through ascription both with Jerusalem and with Old Rome. Its symbolism thus combined both imperial and sacred aspects, although there's no clear separation between the two. The ceremonial book suggests it to have been a place constructed out of ritual, and in turn within which the buildings and spaces served as theatres for the performance of these rituals. These served to represent the identification of the Byzantine city with its Roman predecessor as the capital of empire. Through these forms of identification within performed spaces, these conscious acts of cultural memory, the state and regime asserted its legitimacy. It's argued here that the building forms constituted part of this ceremonial display and of the construction of the meanings of its spatial narrative, both through the opulent spectacle and through the formal associations of the structures, basilicas and centralised halls with Roman imperial architecture, and the framing function of successive gates and porticos, forming thresholds and extending the narrative. Within the palace, late antique building forms, as I said earlier, were perpetuated later than any known examples elsewhere. The iterative forms of basilicas, peristyle courtyards, hemicycles, monumental columns and centrally planned reception halls cannot, I'd argue, be reduced to the mere perpetuation of building techniques, but may be better explained through consideration of their intended iconicity, by which I mean the resemblance between the signifier, the symbol, and the intended meaning. However, such iconic forms cannot be separated from the performances that took place within and through them, through thresholds such as curtains, screens and gates, passages designed for processions, and halls which situated the ruler in relation to both his people and to the deity. So what I've drawn there are all the processions, or not all of them, but the ones that passed through the palace described in the Book of Ceremonies. The architecture of the palace may be sought more through a consideration of these spatial itineraries than through a traditional art historical classification where you'd look at building typologies. They form a whole not through their formal congruity, the way buildings fit together, but through their performative relations, how you move through space. However, this is not to say that the formal setting did not contribute to the symbolic meaning. Certainly from the Tetrarchic period, and arguably since the time of Hadrian's Pantheon, celestial symbolism was given architectural form in the often gold mosaic-covered domed reception halls, and gates designed to frame the rising or setting sun. Hence, for example, the existence of golden gates in Thessalonica, in Split and in Constantinople. Sorry about the very rough drawing. Within the Great Palace, burnished bronze gates and gilt bronze roofs, which of course the Crusaders turned into coinage, conveyed a similar symbolism through their enhanced lustre. Statuary and mosaic images combined with figured curtains and gates to demarcate the significant thresholds of the palace. Nonetheless, it was through ritual processions that the various monuments were brought together into a spatial narrative. Through the performance of place, the transcendence of the emperor was ritually affected, both within the palace and in the relationship between palace and city. And so, for example, there's a number of ceremonies where a reception takes place in front of the bronze gates of the halke, the threshold of the palace, and the emperor is received by the guilds of the city who recite their customary speeches, and then he proceeds on either to Hagia Sophia or along the Mesa Road. This transcendence was extended both to the palace itself, which was termed sacred, and to the city. Maria Carrile argues that, quote, the urban development of the city created a symbolic topography that affected the meaning of the city itself, making it a new Jerusalem. Okay. This was affected, as Carrile and Klein note, through the translation of holy relics, both to churches designed to house them and to the palace itself, in the process transforming the city itself into a site for pilgrimage. But the primary destination for relics was the sacred palace itself. A series of chapels, notably the 5th century church of St. Stephen, the proto-martyr, the chapel of the Theotokos of the Pharos, and later the Nea Ecclesia, the new church, were constructed to house relics. This would include a chapel of St. Theodore within the 6th century crown hall, the Chrysotrychlinos. These sacred places became important stations for the palace rituals. Here again appears the function of the palace as a form of ritual city. Indeed, at the height of its development, here designated as the reign of Heraclius from 610 to 641, the early Great Palace constituted a veritable city in its own right, with a vast population of officials, guards and servants. It was both the symbolic and literally the administrative centre of the empire. While early emperors had only spent short periods residing there, by the time of Justinian I it had become the permanent seat of empire. So emperors ceased to be kind of generals on the move and became permanently situated within the palace. The closely guarded palace communicated with the city through the significant sites of the Kathisma, which you can see there, which is basically a royal box overlooking the Hippodrome, and through the monumental entrances, particularly the Halka Gate, which you see here. So this is where the excavation's taken place, which faces the main street of the city, the Mesa or Middle Way. Other entrances included a gate under the Kathisma, eastern gates leading to the polo field or Tsikanisterion, and the southern gates leading to the imperial harbour. The situation of the palace in relation to the city is analogous to that of Antioch and Thessalonica, where a palace appended a pre-existing city. Symbolic topography of the city was necessarily transformed, and a new hierarchy was established in which the public centre shifted from the region of the Acropolis to the vicinity of Hagia Sophia, the Forum of Augustion and the palace threshold. It remains here to examine its meaning. Ritualised processions are described in several of the itineraries of the Book of Ceremonies, in which the emperor would proceed through the city along a prescribed route, receiving a series of set acclamations and praying at specified churches. Through these processions, the palace was ritually connected to the city. The main palace gate, the Halka, was integrally connected to this triumphal geography, as reflected in its internal decorative program as described by Procopius, in which the victory of the great general Belisarius over the Vandals in North Africa was commemorated, presumably relating to his triumph of 534 through the city. The ritual importance of the Halka Gate also serves to explain the emphasis given to it in the Book of Ceremonies. It presented a sculptural and iconic tableau to the city. The facade and the propylaea, the columned forecourt, were decorated both with statues of members of the ruling dynasty and with magical creatures, one of which you see on the right here. Supposedly, it was on the gate that led into the Augustius, or Augustium, I should say, the forum. The vestibule and its courtyard are revealed in the Book of Ceremonies as an important station in the ritual passage of emperor from palace to city. It was equally important as a threshold for visitors to the palace, in the accounts of whom the palace appears as a vast and labyrinthine complex, which is no doubt an intended impression. They would literally be led through corridor after corridor, from hall to hall, and become completely mesmerised and lost. Transitional sites, such as the gates forming thresholds, were evidently spaces of appearance. When the emperor passed through the main gate of Halka, he was received, as I said, by representatives of the city. And these can be differentiated from the various enclosed basilicas and triclinia in which the emperor and his court would meet. The central meaning of the ceremonial, the restatement of the relationship of the ruler and his people, and the reinscription of both urban and palatial sites with symbolic meaning is surely the message which the mosaic conveys, the ruler hailed by his people as protector of the city. My suggested reconstruction of the palace contests both hypotheses that its layer formed a unified whole, like the Emperor Diocletian's retirement palace at Split, or those like Jonathan Bardell's that characterise it as dispersed and park-like. Instead, I'd argue that the early Great Palace, like its analogues, was composed of discrete architectural elements that were assembled together, often in an apparently awkward manner. I'll go through a few examples of them. The grouping around the Chrysotriklinos, or Golden Hall or Golden Dining Room, formed the lower palace at about 16 metres above sea level. It included at least one courtyard, known as the Terrace of the Pharos, or Lighthouse, and was linked to both the harbour on the Sea of Marmara and to the upper palace by a series of linking halls and stairs. So here you see a very rough reconstruction, and a terrace which overlooks one of the factions' courtyards and connects on the western side up to the city, up to the central palace. A second complex existed at 26 metres above sea level, the level of the courtyard named the Covered Hippodrome. Or it's so Covered Hippodrome is around about here, we're not sure. This is the mosaic peristyle, the apse court. So all of this complex connecting to this hemicycle and triconch was on the 26-metre terrace. At the heart of the palace was the Daphne Palace, at about 32 metres above sea level, close to the level of the adjacent hippodrome, now known as At Maidan, the heart of the modern tourist bit of the city. Like its imperial and tetrarchic predecessors, the Daphne Palace had a close relationship to the circus by means of the imperial rostrum or kathisma, and was really one of the few times that the public was permitted to see the emperor. It was a sort of formal centre for interaction between emperor and people. Whether or not commenced under Constantine the Great, by the period of Theodosius II, say early to mid-5th century at the latest, the Daphne Palace appears to have constituted the domestic quarter of a larger palace that, like the earlier Flavian Palace on the Palatine, also possessed a public ceremonial complex, given the location of the Magnara, the Halke, the Senate, and the Church of Hagia Sophia near the main street of Regia. North of the Daphne Palace was the area of the guards' quarters and administrative offices known as the Scholae, or schools. These officers guarded the entrance route from the Halka gate and its internal court. Further north, connected by a gate, was the Hall of Magnara, an important site for imperial receptions. So there's roughly the Magnara laid over the archaeology, and the administrative complex is all of this terrace. So the bit I showed you earlier is just this bit, but it extends all the way up to the gate. Gives you an idea of the scale. The Great Palace as a whole was therefore profoundly different in nature from the reconstructions of ancient palaces by Renaissance and Baroque architects, in which a formal cohesion formed the primary focus. And I'd like to draw an analogy with the bricolage-like visions of ancient Rome etched by Piranesi in the 18th century, where he describes a city that's organised at a local scale and disorganised at a large scale. So far I've merely discussed the general topography of the palace. The Book of Ceremonies and other texts, such as the Anapadosis of Liutprand of Cremona, a Lombard emissary, provides information on specific buildings. Within the Daphne Palace there are numerous mentions of the Great Trickling, later named the Hall of 19 Couches, Arcubita, which together with the Augustius, a basilican crown hall, was faced by a portico that overlooked the court of Delphax, supposedly because of Delphic columns which were erected there. Behind these reception halls were domestic chambers, a private hall named the Octagon, which connected with a palace chapel of St. Stephen, and other small private chapels. A reference by John of Antioch to columns brought from Delphi suggests this complex of the Daphne was of very early date, possibly built by Constantine I, as tradition held, if not by his immediate successors. For example, the Theodosians, maybe Theodosius I, who erected the obelisks and made Constantinople his permanent capital. The earlier halls located on the 26-metre level below were the apse, the sigma and triconch, and the thermastra, which is one of the palace baths. And in this lower area there's archaeological evidence for structures of the time of Justinian. The private chamber of the Octagon and the Daphne Palace, which is here in my reconstruction, appears to have been for a time the room the emperor entered when returning from the Hippodrome by means of a spiral staircase from the Kathisma. A further arrangement of passages enabled the emperor to communicate in all directions through the complex. The Octagon and the Chapel of St. Stephen were also the original sites used for imperial wedding ceremonies, thus underlying their ceremonial importance within the palace. Finally, there does appear to be a symbolic association in the use of the octagonal form within the palace with the imperial tradition of Sol Invictus, conquering sun. This derivation from the pagan imperial cult of the Tetrarchic period is also evidenced, Gilbert Dagron has argued, by the use of solar symbols in the Hippodrome, the two obelisks and the snake column from Delphi, located on the spina of the Hippodrome in front of the imperial loge, in his opinion, within the Kathisma. One of these halls in the Daphne, the Great Trickling, or Hall of 19 Couches, is crucial for the reconstruction of the palace layout because of its apparent size. It was the largest hall in the palace and opened onto the primary courtyard of Delphax. From the account of Liutprand of Cremona, its roof appears to have been clad in gilt bronze tiles, which, given its apparently vast size, would have made it a major visual landmark within the city and when viewed from the sea. The hall was the primary reception venue for the court. During the 12 feast days of Christmas, the emperor dined at his semicircular table with 12 invited guests reclining on couches, standing for the 12 disciples. However, there were 18 other tables, each with up to 12 guests, thus a total of some 229 diners, reclining in Roman style, served by an army of servants and entertainers. Its length may be estimated on the basis of this building, which we know because it's been excavated just north of the Palace of Antiochus, as up to 135 metres long, facing northeast. Now, if you look at the largest hall of the Renaissance and Baroque period, the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, its length is only 73 metres long. So this is almost double that length, which gives you an idea of the scale. It seems to have been quite possibly the largest hall in antiquity. Clearly, if the Great Trickling was this large and parallel with the Hippodrome, then previous reconstructions of the palace simply don't work. You can't fit it. This is one of the examples we look at to try to reconstruct the Hall of 19 Couches. It was built in the early 9th century by a pope in the Lateran Palace, and was erected after a split between the Eastern and Western Church and the assertion of the popes in Rome of religious authority. The historian Luchterhahn attributes this hall, which is about 70 metres long, to Pope Leo III's desire to compete with the example of the Great Palace at a time of religious schism. The relationship between the Hippodrome and the Great Palace in the early period is implied in a chapter of the Book of Ceremonies, which describes the proclaiming of Anastasius as emperor in 491 AD, in which, on the death of the emperor Zeno, the archons, senators and bishops assemble in the portico in front of the great hall overlooking the courtyard called Delphax. Then the Augusta Ariadne, the widow of Zeno, goes up into the Hippodrome from the palace to address the people gathered there from a throne that was raised up behind a barrier, then goes down to re-enter the hall of the Augustius. The court asks Ariadne to select a new emperor. She selects Anastasius. He is brought to the palace and is kept safe in the consistorium, a great reception hall at the threshold between the private palace and the guards' quarters. After the funeral of the dead emperor, Anastasius is brought to the middle of the portico in front of the great hall, where he swears oaths for good governance in front of the court. This great hall might signify either the crown hall of Augustius, but was more likely the vast dining hall of 19 couches. Anastasius then goes up to the reception hall in the Hippodrome, where he changes and emerges in full sight of the people and is raised up on a shield in the tradition of the Roman army, literally elevated to the imperial throne. A similar procedure seems to have taken place for the following emperor, Justin I, with the debate over succession taking place in the portico in front of the great hall. There is mention of one faction raising up their candidate on the middle couch, which may refer to the main apse of the great dining hall. Rival claimants are reported to be knocking at the ivory door of the palace seeking the imperial regalia before Justin is selected and raised up before the people in the Hippodrome in the same fashion. From these passages, compiled during the reign of Justinian I in the mid-6th century, it is clear that at the time of the events, the Daphne Palace complex was already in existence, together with the first kathisma by which the palace communicated with the Hippodrome. One building complex in the Great Palace that has been assumed to be of the 9th century may in fact have been much older, perhaps from the period of Justinian or before. This is a drawing I did based upon a Byzantine text, the Chronographia of Theophanes Continuatus, probably written during the reign of Constantine VII. The enclosed fountain court of the Triconch, also named as the Sigma and Triconch because of the Greek symbol sigma, and which Theophanes attributes to the reign of Theophilus in the early 9th century, may equally have been a renovation or restoration of a late antique reception hall. It appears to be the same essential type as the examples I've been showing you early in the talk. Now, the description is so good that it actually tells you how many columns there are, so I was able to get an approximate reconstruction of the entirety of this complex, which exists on 2 or 3 levels. 2 main levels, with a double-storey semicircular colonnade extending from the facade of a triconchal hall, a quintessential Roman type, under which appears to have been a sort of grotto, an echoing basement, also triconchal, that led out to the courtyard. On the facing western wall of the courtyard was a fountain which gushed water and occasionally wine from 2 lions' heads. Behind the fountain was a chamber of unknown use, but perhaps a kind of nymphaeum or pleasure pavilion. And this, of course, recalls the pavilions of Hadrian's villa. The emperor would mount his throne at the head of the hemicycle, with his court forming a semicircle around him to receive the acclamations there of the city factions standing a level below. This fountain court and triconch, together with the mosaic peristyle and apse hall, became a distinct palace complex during and after the reign of Theophilus. Running out of time?
Yes.
I'd better speed up. To summarise my topographical scheme, the covered hippodrome at the terraced level of around 26 metres was adjacent to the bars to its east and communicated to the mosaic peristyle, here identified with the apse. The passages of the apse led north to the enclosed fountain court and south to a staircase which connected to the upper and lower palaces. To the north of the covered hippodrome, the Daphne stood on two known levels, the upper level that of the reception halls, portico and court of Delphax, and connected to the kathisma via a spiral staircase, as I said. A route ran from the covered hippodrome via the thermastra to a lower level of the semicircular fountain court of the sigma, enabling the fountain court to serve effectively as a means of entry into the central palace. Okay, I'll skip past this bit. This is the second complex I tried to reconstruct. It's the Chrysotrychlinos, which eventually became the main crown hall of the palace and the place where guests would be received. And the point I'm making, of course, is you look at this architecture and it's quintessentially Roman, but it's Roman existing in a period that is well into the Middle Ages. An octagonal hall with a series of vaults extending from it, which was sufficient to accommodate over 100 dining guests. So there's a possible reconstruction of how they might have been housed in Roman style. And the hall could also be used for the promotion of officials or reception of emissaries or ambassadors by closing off the vaults with curtains, silk curtains, which creates essentially a linear hall where the court would be assembled on either side. And those two spaces to the side are also recorded as locations for choirs to sing. So it was possibly the origin of antiphonal singing. And at other times, members of the court, the aristocracy, could be positioned in those two side chambers with the members of the household arranged around the emperor. Okay. Oh no. Okay. Well, this is just a section through it, and I'll just end with this image, which is trying to visualise how this hall, which is one of the grandest ones in the palace, might have appeared to an ambassador who's arriving after all those passages in the forecourt and being received by the gatekeeper before offering his homage to the emperor. I'll leave it there.